Picture this. A woman, 53 years old, heavyset, wearing her dead husband's old flannel jacket because it's the warmest thing she has, sitting cross-legged on the cold limestone floor of a cave she now calls home. Flashlight duct taped to the wall above her, throwing a yellowish cone of light across the composition notebook in her lap. The kind of notebook you buy at a dollar store, wire-bound, wide-ruled. She's filling it with drawings, measurements, notes in a handwriting that's half engineering sketch, half field journal, half something else entirely. Something that nobody who saw her on Elm Creek Road last year would have believed she was capable of. Outside that cave, it's October in Oklahoma. The sky is doing that thing it does before the cold really sets in. Clear and very blue and slightly threatening in a way you can't quite name. The land she's sitting under belonged to her husband. It belonged to her before that. Randy's been gone 14 months. The bank came for the house. The neighbors who used to wave hello from their driveways. Well, they'd already started not seeing her before Randy's body was cold. That's how it goes sometimes. The person who was the reason you were visible disappears, and then you do too. At least to the people who were only ever looking at you in relation to him. And the word they left ringing in her ears when they stopped looking? Useless. Said right there on her porch. Loud enough that the whole street could hear it if they were paying attention. And some of them were. I need you to hold that image. Deborah in the cave, the notebook, the flashlight, the cold stone under her. Because this story is going to pull you somewhere else for a few minutes. It's going to take you out to where Tulsa County is baking in a drought that's making water officials sweat through their shirts in air-conditioned offices and talk in careful, measured language about contingency planning and resource management protocols, which is what you say when you're trying not to say that you don't have a solution. It's going to show you what a region looks like when it runs dry. And then, it's going to bring you right back to that cave, to that notebook, to the woman who turned out to be sitting on top of the answer the whole county was looking for. Here's the thing about being completely written off by the people around you. Sometimes, not always, not neatly, not in a way that makes the pain feel worth it. But sometimes, it puts you exactly where you need to be. If you want stories that go somewhere most people aren't looking, stories about what strength actually looks like in real life, not the movie version, subscribe now, because that is exactly what I'm here for every week. What I found in Deborah's story is the kind of thing that should be famous. It's not. And that's almost the whole point. Let's go back to where it really started. So, Tulsa County, that summer. The drought came in quiet, the way droughts always do. No announcement, no obvious beginning. Just, the rain stopped coming with the frequency it needed to. Week 1, you don't think about it. Week 3, farmers start looking at their fields with a different kind of attention. Week 8, the reservoirs are dropping faster than the model said they should, and people in the water management offices are having meetings that end without solutions, and that nobody's writing press releases about yet. By the time it went public, rationing notices, hosepipe advisories, grocery stores selling out of bottled water by Tuesday of every week. The situation behind closed doors was already worse than what they were telling people. The county's primary reservoir was sitting at 31% of capacity. A secondary source they'd been counting on as backup had contamination issues that had been known about quietly for a while. The emergency protocols existed. The protocols assumed there were identified alternative water sources to activate when needed. There weren't, not real ones, not surveyed, confirmed, accessible ones. Now, keep something in the back of your mind while I tell you the rest of this story. Keep this there. The ground underneath Tulsa County holds water. It always has. The aquifer systems under that region are ancient, thousands of years in the making, built by geological processes that don't care about what's happening on the surface. Water finds its way into those systems, and it stays. The question isn't whether the water is there. The question is whether anybody knows where to look for it. And it turned out somebody did. She just wasn't the kind of somebody that anyone in Tulsa County's water authority had ever thought to ask. She wasn't a geologist. She wasn't a hydrologist. She was a fat widow living in a cave on land the county had valued at almost nothing, with a flashlight and a composition notebook and a method she'd borrowed from her dead husband's fishing journals. That's who she was, and that was exactly enough. Deborah McAllister, Deborah Stokes, before she married Randy, in a ceremony at First Methodist in 1991 with exactly 32 people in attendance, which she still remembers as the perfect number, had grown up about 40 miles outside of Tulsa, in the kind of small town where people measure how long a family has been around in generations, rather than years. She was not the kind of woman who announced herself. That's the thing you have to understand about her going in. She didn't take up much social space even when she was taking up a lot of physical space, which is a particular quality that gets misread constantly. People look at a quiet, heavy woman, and they see smallness. They see apology. They see someone who already knows she's taking up more than her share and is trying to compensate. That's not what they were seeing with Deborah. What they were seeing was a woman who had learned, early and thoroughly, that thinking out loud was expensive in environments where being wrong cost more than being silent. She had a mind that worked in systems. That's the best way I can put it. She saw the way things connected underneath the way things looked. She saw patterns in data that other people filed as noise. She had the kind of patience for detail that most people find boring to watch and terrifying to need, because it requires slowing down to a pace that modern life really doesn't want you to slow down to. Randy saw it. Randy McAllister was everything Deborah wasn't on the surface. He was loud and expressive and physically imposing in a completely different way, the kind of man who fills a room with his laugh before his body even quite arrives. He'd spotted Deborah across a church social in 1989 and done the unusual thing of sitting down next to her and actually listening to her when she talked, rather than waiting for his turn to talk, which was apparently rare enough in her experience that she found it remarkable. "You see everything," he told her, years later when they were sitting on the porch after dinner on a summer night. "You just don't always say what you see." She'd thought about that for a while. Then she'd said, "Saying it doesn't always help." He'd nodded. He understood. They built their life on Elm Creek Road. A real life, not a spectacular one, not an Instagram one, a real one with mortgage payments and disagreements about the thermostat and years that were better and years that were harder, and a daughter they raised to be tougher than they'd been, and who had moved to Portland and called every Sunday and didn't know yet how bad things had gotten. The land on the back end of the property, the rocky, scrubby, good-for-nothing land with the cave system that everybody described as that eyesore, including Randy. Randy had bought at a county auction on a whim 15 years back, for almost nothing, because he thought the kids might think it was cool to have a cave. They'd gone in it twice. After that, it just sat there, collecting the reputation of being worthless. Randy died on a Tuesday morning in November, 58 years old, in his truck on the way to a job site. Heart attack. No warning. No goodbye. Just Tuesday morning, and then the phone call. She found out the rest of the financial picture in the months that followed. Not all at once. It came in pieces, the way the worst things do. Randy had made some decisions in the last 2 years that he hadn't shared with her completely. Not dishonest exactly, just optimistic in the way that people get optimistic when they're scared, when they're hoping things will turn around before they have to have the hard conversation. Things had not turned around. The morning they said it to her face, Deborah had been up since 4. She'd been at the kitchen table with the accounts again, not because she hadn't been through them before, but because going through them was the only activity that made her feel like she was doing something even when there was nothing to do. The numbers didn't change no matter how many times she looked at them. That didn't stop her from looking. It's a particular kind of torture that careful people put themselves through. She'd made coffee. Real coffee. Not because she was trying to be luxurious, but because good coffee was one of the things she'd decided she was not going to give up before she had to, and she'd sat at the table until the sun came up. The light changed the kitchen from gray to yellow in the way that sunrise light does, and it didn't help with the numbers, but it helped a little with everything else. She went out to the porch to get some air. Stand in the sun for a minute. The kind of thing you do when you've been staring at your own walls for too long. The Prestons were out in their driveway. Martin and Carol Preston, 9 years of proximity, which in Deborah's mind counted as something. Their kids had played with her daughter when the kids were small. She'd brought them a lasagna when Carol's mother passed. They'd come to Randy's memorial and hugged her and said all the things people say. She'd believed them when they said them. She raised her hand. What happened next took about 4 seconds total. The sound traveled across 20 feet of suburban driveway on a still November morning with the clarity that cold air gives to things you'd rather not hear distinctly. One of them, she won't say which one, and I'm not going to push, said something to the other, low and apparently not quite low enough, in that conversational register people use for things they consider too self-evident to be worth hiding. And the word came back to her with the kind of crystalline precision that you only get when you're not expecting to hear something and your brain registers it before your defenses can. Useless, not angry. That's what stays with her. Not that they were angry at her, not that she'd done something to earn it, not even that they disliked her particularly. Just factual, like a weather assessment. Like the kind of thing you say about an object that has outlived its function. The car that won't start anymore. The appliance that doesn't work. The woman on the porch in the borrowed flannel jacket who no longer has a role to play in the neighborhood narrative, and therefore no longer quite exists. Nobody stepped in. Nobody opened their door and called something out. Elm Creek Road continued with its morning in the way that streets continue with their mornings. Deborah stood there on her porch for what felt like a long time and was probably 30 seconds. Then she went inside. She sat back down at the kitchen table, not with the accounts this time, just sitting. She let it hit her all the way, because she had learned the hard way that the things you don't let hit you all the way just sit in your body and compound. Then she thought about the cave. The bank put the notice on her door 6 weeks later. She'd seen it coming. She was too precise to not see it coming, and she had made her decisions before it arrived. The house was Randy's debt to lose. The back land was almost nothing in value, which meant almost nobody wanted it, which meant it was hers to keep. She knew the cave was there. She had been in it exactly 3 times in her adult life. She thought about it for 2 days after the bank notice arrived, sitting with the specific quality of that thought that is neither panic nor calm, but something more like, okay, what do I actually have? She packed what fit in 2 trash bags. She chose carefully, because she was always careful. Books she'd flagged as useful, a geological survey of the region that she'd found in a used bookstore years back without knowing why she bought it, a manual on basic fieldwork methodology, one on structural geology for non-specialists, Randy's composition notebooks, the ones he'd mapped his fishing spots in, obsessive and precise, grid by grid. Her sleeping bag, 3 changes of clothes, her bookkeeping ledgers, which felt almost absurd to take, but which she couldn't leave because they contained the clearest record of where she stood. And one thing she bought specifically for this on the way out, a quality flashlight and 4 packs of batteries. She moved into the cave on a Thursday in February. No running water, no power, no insulation. Just her, the dark, and the limestone. The first week was about understanding the cold. The cave maintained a constant temperature of around 55 degrees, regardless of what the winter outside was doing. She measured it with a thermometer she'd brought 3 times a day, because she was that kind of person. 55 degrees is uncomfortable if you're not layered properly, and survivable if you are. She layered properly. She found the warmest sleeping spots. A natural alcove about 40 feet in where the rock seemed to hold a fraction more warmth. And she established her routines. The smell of the cave was specific and strong in a way she hadn't expected. Mineral and cold and something underneath both of those. Something that she couldn't name at first, but that she eventually understood was the smell of water at pressure. Not open water, not a stream, but water pressing through stone. She started noticing the formations in the second week, sections of wall that had crystal structures she didn't recognize from the few minutes of internet research she'd managed at the library. a passage that opened into a larger chamber where the floor was notably warmer than the surrounding stone. A sound in one section of wall, very faint, requiring her to press her ear to the limestone and stay completely still. That was either her imagination or something moving behind the rock. She pressed her ear to that wall every morning for a week before she let herself believe she was hearing what she was hearing. She started with Randy's system because it was the one she knew. Randy had kept his fishing journals with an attention to detail that most people reserve for things that matter professionally. Every pond, every creek, every section of the river had been gridded and catalogued, depth estimates, temperature readings, notes on what he'd found at what time of year and at what depth. He'd done it because it made him better at finding fish, and because he found the process itself satisfying in the way that some people find crosswords satisfying, the reduction of something vast and variable into something organized and known. Deborah did the same thing to the cave. She gave every section a designation in the grid. She mapped the passages she could safely enter, noting ceiling height, floor stability, the nature of the rock formations, the specific quality of the air. She tracked the temperature variations across sections, which were telling her something about airflow. She documented the mineral deposits, which had patterns she was beginning to understand were consistent with specific types of water interaction with limestone over time. She noted where the crystal formations appeared and what they looked like under the flashlight and how they changed as she went deeper. Going deeper than she'd planned wasn't recklessness. It was evidence. Because every time she went deeper, the evidence got clearer. The mineral density increased. The temperature variations became more pronounced. The smell she'd first noticed, that specific, pressured underground water smell, got stronger as she moved toward the eastern passages, and the sound she'd heard pressing her ear to the wall in the main chamber. That sound appeared again, in different sections, each time slightly louder, each time more definitively not her imagination. She started a new notebook. Her own notebook this time, not Randy's. 6 weeks in. At 2 months she'd filled it and was into a second. The discovery came not as a single dramatic moment, but as a series of confirmations accumulating past the point where doubt was reasonable. The eastern passage led to a crawl space that led to a chamber. The chamber was large. She estimated it by the way her voice echoed, and the way the flashlight beam lost itself in the dark beyond her reach. The walls were heavily encrusted with formations that her geological survey book told her were associated with long-term, sustained water exposure from below. And when she pressed her hand to the east wall of that chamber, she could feel, not just hear, but feel, a very faint vibration that could only be explained by moving water in significant volume. She sat in that chamber for 2 hours the first time she found it, by flashlight, cross-referencing everything she'd mapped with what the geology book said should be there. Then she opened a fresh page in the notebook and wrote a word at the top. Aquifer. And below it, coordinates, depth estimate, confidence level, and a question in her own handwriting. Who do I tell? The drought was already on the radio by the time she'd filled her third notebook. She listened every night on the battery-powered radio she'd added to her setup after the first month, lying in her sleeping bag in the alcove, the cold of the limestone at her back. The coverage started careful, the kind of measured broadcast language that's designed to convey seriousness without triggering panic, which is a difficult needle to thread and which, when you're used to reading underneath language, tells you more than the actual words do. What Deborah heard underneath the careful language was, "We don't have a real backup plan." The contingency measures they were describing were theoretical. The alternative sources they referenced were either not fully developed or not fully confirmed. The numbers they cited, reservoir percentages, estimated days of supply at current consumption rates, were numbers that only made sense if you assumed things would improve significantly in the next 6 to 8 weeks, and there was no particular reason to assume that. She went back to her notebooks. She cross-referenced her cave maps with the geological survey maps she'd managed to get copies of at the county library. She made a supply run every 2 weeks, partly for food and partly for this. The aquifer she'd found. if her identification was correct, if her methodology was sound, was not on any of the county's maps. It hadn't been surveyed. It wasn't in the Water Authority's resource inventory. It was unknown. Unknown because nobody had looked here, because the land had been written off, because the cave had been considered worthless, because of all the things that had happened in the past year, which she had not chosen and had not wanted, and which had put her exactly here, exactly now, with exactly this knowledge. She refined her estimates. She documented her methodology in a format a professional could follow and evaluate. She wrote it all out in the 4th notebook and then typed it up, cleanly and precisely, on a library computer. She printed it twice. She put one copy in a waterproof bag in the cave. The other one she mailed to the Tulsa County Water Authority, certified, on a Tuesday morning when the county was 9 weeks into rationing. The call she eventually got wasn't from the Water Authority. 2 weeks after she mailed the letter, she'd heard nothing. A follow-up phone call from the library got her a polite voicemail response about how they received many public submissions and appreciated community input. She understood the translation. She had sent it anyway because not sending it would have been a choice she couldn't live with. What happened instead was a woman named Linda Garza. Linda was a geologist with a regional consulting firm that the county had hired 4.5 months into the drought, when the careful official language had given way to less careful official language, to do a rapid assessment of potential alternative water sources. Linda had been given a folder of tips and public letters to sort through as part of her intake process. Most of the folder was not worth serious attention. A few items in it were worth a second look. Deborah's letter was in the folder. Linda read it once. Then she read it again, more slowly. Then she looked up the land parcel number Deborah had referenced, found that it was indeed an area with geological characteristics consistent with what the letter described, and got in her car. The drive to the cave took 40 minutes. The walk to the cave entrance took another 10. The walk through the cave, with Deborah as her guide, took the better part of 2 days. Deborah walked Linda through every section, every grid designation, every notation, the temperature variations and what they indicated, the mineral patterns and what they meant in terms of historical water activity, the crawl space to the eastern chamber, and what was in the chamber and what you felt when you pressed your hand to the east wall. The acoustic analysis, the method Deborah had developed over months by tapping different sections of limestone at different depths and timing the responses, which was not a standard technique but which was internally consistent and, as it turned out, accurate. Linda Garza, who had a geology degree from OU and 15 years of field experience and a professional vocabulary for all of this, that Deborah had to partly reconstruct from library books, said progressively less as she went through the cave. Not because she was losing interest, because what she was seeing was sound. The methodology was unorthodox. The data was real. The aquifer was there. It was large, significantly larger than Deborah's conservative estimates had allowed for. It was clean. It was accessible. The optimal entry point for drilling, the spot that would reach the greatest volume with the lowest risk of contamination, was exactly where Deborah had marked it on her map. The county drilled 2 weeks later. She moved out of the cave in the spring. Not because anyone made her. The land was still hers, as was the cave, as was whatever quiet pride she'd built there. She moved out because she'd been offered a small consulting stipend by the County Water Authority during the process of confirming and developing the aquifer site, and because it turned out that having income, even modest income, opened up options she hadn't had in a while. She rented a small house about 3 miles from Elm Creek Road. She still drove past it sometimes. The Prestons still lived there, as far as she could tell. Their cars were in the driveway on the morning she went past. Sometimes one of them would be outside when she drove by. She waved. She always waved. Not because they deserved it, necessarily. Not because what happened on the porch was okay, or forgotten, or small. But because being the kind of person who waves is not the same as being the kind of person who pretends nothing happened. She could be both. She was both. Linda Garza wrote about the aquifer discovery in a professional journal. Deborah is mentioned in it, not by name, because Deborah asked not to be named, and Linda respected that. She's referred to as a local landowner whose observations and self-developed survey methodology first identified the site, which is accurate, which is, in Deborah's opinion, enough. The composition notebooks, all 4 of them, plus the ones that came after, are in a filing box in her spare room now. She keeps them. She's not entirely sure why. Maybe because they're the record of what one winter's work actually looks like. Not the dramatic version, not the movie version, but the real version. The pages filled by flashlight. The measurements refined across weeks. The methodology borrowed from a dead man's fishing journals and applied to something that turned out to matter. Here's what I want to leave you with about Deborah. Not the aquifer. Not the drought being resolved. Not the county official who called her when it was confirmed and said the things that people say when they owe someone an acknowledgement they should have given much earlier. Those things happened, and they matter. But they're not the part that stays with me. The part that stays with me is October. The cave, the flashlight, the page in the 4th notebook that just says aquifer at the top and then underneath, coordinates, depth estimate, confidence level, and the question, who do I tell? She wrote that question because she genuinely didn't know. She had found something that mattered enormously, and she had no social position from which to say so. No credential, no institutional backing, no professional network, no relationship with anyone in the county water system that would make them pick up the phone quickly when she called. She had data and methodology, and she had the question of who, if anyone, would take her seriously enough to look. And I keep thinking about that gap, the gap between knowing something and being in a position to have people believe you know it. Because it's not a gap that's unique to Deborah. It's a gap that a lot of people live in. People who have spent their lives building real knowledge in ways that don't get institutional recognition. People who see things accurately, but who don't have the credentials to make other people stop and listen. People who, for one reason or another, have been moved to the margins, and who sometimes find, there at the margins, that they're looking at exactly what needs to be found. That's not a guarantee. I want to be clear that it's not a guarantee. Most people in Deborah's situation don't find an undiscovered aquifer. Most people in Deborah's situation just keep going, keep doing the work, keep following the data wherever it leads without knowing if it's going to lead anywhere that anyone else will care about. But here's what doesn't change, regardless of outcome. The notebook still gets filled, the mapping still happens, the attention still gets paid, and that, the willingness to pay attention to the thing in front of you with everything you've got. Even when nobody's watching, even when nobody asked, even when the neighbors on Elm Creek Road have already made their assessment of your worth. That is not useless. That is the opposite of useless. It just doesn't always announce itself the way it should.